Welcome back to Manchester, where in 20 minutes' time, the Chancellor will address Conservative Party conference. This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative MP Anthony Browne, the Financial Times' Stephen Bush, and former Conservative advisor Joe Tanner. In 20 minutes, we'll be hearing from the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. He'll promise to increase the national living wage to £11, and there'll be sanctions and incentives to get those on long-term sickness benefits back to work. So, we know quite a lot about what we think the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is going to say. Of course, there has been a row just ahead of conference and no doubt over the next few days over the issue of tax and whether there should be tax cuts now or at least before the next general election. But my opening question for our guest, starting with you, Anthony, is whatever the Chancellor says today or pledges to do, is there any chance voters will feel better off by the next election?
Well, certainly. I mean, the economy is showing signs of growing faster again. We've had the new figures from the ONS. We've now got the fastest growing economy, major economy in Europe. Unemployment is half the level it was in 2010.
Yeah, but will people feel better
Earnings are rising. With the last month's figures, earnings are rising faster than inflation. I mean, it's no doubt the cost of living crisis is still with us, but inflation is coming down. The economy is picking up. Confidence is slowly returning. So hopefully by the next election, in a year or so's time, people will feel better off.
Do you agree with that, Stephen? I mean, particularly on the issue of inflation, the rate at which prices are rising. The government says it's their #1 priority, and yet it's still at 6.7, 6.8%, costing people a lot of money in their pockets. Is there any chance voters will feel better off at the next election?
Well, I think relative to the amount of upward pressure on prices even a month ago, yes. All things being equal, provided there isn't another price shock of some form or another. I think objectively the statistics will be pointing in a positive direction for the government. But of course, for most people, they will still feel much worse off than they did 5 years ago. And for most, we see this in all of the polls, and indeed when, we in very different capacities go around knocking on doors, right? But we all hear, and what people think of when the government says inflation will be back down is that those price increases will be unwound, which is not going to happen. So I think the trouble for the government is that, particularly this kind of final phase of the Conservative government, is they'll have quite a good story to tell in terms of calming the markets after the Liz Truss experiment, inflation going back down, but that will sound a little bit like their Marie Antoinette figures to most people in the country. So a good story in terms of the stats, but in terms of the politics, maybe not a very good one at all.
What do you think, Joe? Do you think people will feel better off at the next election, yes, compared to perhaps the last election?
Yeah, I mean, it's what period are you comparing it to? And which individuals, how do you measure feeling better off? It depends for a lot of people what that means. For people that had mortgages, that their rates went sky high and they might have locked into a deal that actually wasn't that great. As interest rates start to come down, are they going to feel locked into a deal that they wish they hadn't got locked into, but they were worried it was going to get worse? Are there businesses that have been struggling that actually might have laid people off? Are there going to be people that aren't in jobs that they were in 2 years ago, for example, or 4 years ago? So, it's relative for different people. The principle is that I think there's probably a fair group of people that will feel that under the Conservatives they haven't fared that well. So Jeremy's got quite a big challenge ahead.
Well, he has indeed, and as I say, he'll be taking to the stage for his big conference speech, probably just after 2 o'clock, speaking for probably 25 minutes to half an hour. But there has been another issue raging again before conference and no doubt being discussed on all of the fringes, and that is the issue of immigration and migration, following the Home Secretary Suella Braverman's speech recently in Washington, where she said, amongst other things, that multiculturalism has failed. Here's David Davis, whom I spoke to earlier, former Brexit minister and leadership contender, responding to that.
Every policy you have has got wrinkles and issues and problems along the way. But broadly speaking, actually, the story of multiculturalism since the Second World War in this country is a success, not a failure.
Do you believe in the Rwanda policy to
Well, no,
outsource?
I'm known not to. I mean, look, the House of Commons has made this decision. We've got to try and make it work. But the simple truth is, I've never thought that would work. And in any event, the sort of turning around and saying, "Oh, the courts are stopping us doing what we need to do." No. What happened was the court said these specific individuals you have selected wrongly. The court was doing what they're supposed to do, and that is make the government obey the law. So I think it's an area of policy where it's quite easy to make headlines. It's quite easy to create an argument with somebody else, with liberal London, if you like. But actually, the facts of the matter say ECHR is working fine. The policy's got to be worked through properly. Let's see if it works.
But where will you be at the next general election if the Conservative Party, having had a discussion about the European Convention on Human Rights, decides in its manifesto we're going to leave the European Convention?
Well, I will differ from them. I will just say I don't agree with that part of the manifesto. Look, very often when people argue about this, they cite a case from the past, which I was involved in. And that was when the European Court said we had to give prisoners the vote. Now, it's a bit esoteric, but it was very controversial at the time in David Cameron's day. I stopped that by having moving a motion in the House of Commons which overruled the court. So, this is a much more subtle area than people realise. The court has overstepped the boundaries before in the past, and we've pushed it back and they've accepted it. So there are lots and lots of ground between where we are today and removing ourselves from the European Court and European Convention, which would undermine existing treaties, reduce our reputation in the world at large for being a law-abiding country, give succor and support to other countries who pulled out, like Belarus and Russia and so on.
Talking just before about Brexit, about the referendum, isn't part of this the suggestion from the Home Secretary and other senior politicians about looking at perhaps leaving the ECHR, finishing what Brexit began?
It's got nothing to do with what Brexit. I mean, Brexit has nothing to do with the ECHR. First,
Controlling your own borders, getting a handle on your own immigration policy.
Well, let's take control of your own borders. We should look around and take lessons from other countries. We allowed something like 80% of Albanians who applied for asylum here into the country early on. Sweden, social democratic, civilized Sweden, a part not just of the ECHR but also of the ECJ, wrote its laws in a way which did not transgress the case law of the ECHR, and they have said no to every single Albanian asylum seeker, and nobody's taken them to court. So it's our bad writing of the laws, not the ECHR, that's the problem. And time again, the people who make this argument make it from a point of view of simply not having checked the law properly.
Well, that was David Davis talking to me earlier today. Let's welcome Miriam Cates onto the panel, Conservative MP. David Davis is very clear. You do not need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights in order to control the UK's borders.
Well, let's see, because the Supreme Court are about to rule on whether they think that is true or not. And I would agree with David that there's nothing wrong with the actual law, the legislation, the agreement that was made a long time ago, just after the Second World War. The trouble is, the ECHR is a living convention, and judges have interpreted it more widely and more widely over the years. And so now it's this enormous piece of legislation, of case law, that goes far beyond what was originally intended. And therein lies the problem. And thanks to the Illegal Migration Act, we do, in theory, have the power to refuse to acknowledge their decisions, but whether or not that happens in practice is yet to be seen. So I do think we have to be prepared to leave it if we need to in order to protect our own borders.
But there's been a failure of government policy on its own terms up until now. Rishi Sunak made that very clear pledge. There is a big difference between legal and illegal migration. The government's also slightly rewritten the rules on that. But they said, or he said, he would stop the boats, and yet the number of people coming across has gone up. Brexit was supposed to be the moment at which numbers would perhaps come down or at least be controlled. That hasn't happened. It's a failure of government policy, nothing else.
Well, let's separate out legal and illegal migration, because they are obviously two very different things governed by different law. So on legal migration, we are in control over the number of people who come here. And it is a failure of government policy that we set the bar so low in terms of work visas and student visas. I agree with that. On illegal migration, it is more complicated because the main plank of our policy is the Rwanda plan, this deterrent that will break the business model of the people traffickers. Now, it is absolutely the judgment of the ECHR that has stopped us so far implementing the Rwanda plan, and we are a year later still waiting for the most recent judgment. So it is the case that the way that our own courts, because of the Human Rights Act, interpret the ECHR will not allow the Rwanda plan to take place.
Anthony, do you agree with Miriam?
Well, look, clearly the ECHR has had absolutely massive mission creep over the years, and it's doing all sorts of things that the original writers of it, which included the UK, weren't foreseeing. But I do think leaving it should be a last resort. I think there is quite a lot, as David Davis was saying, that we do to gold-plate it and overinterpret it, and we obey it in ways that other countries don't necessarily. But it clearly is also the case that the ECHR has stopped the Rwanda plan, and the Rwanda plan is the main.
But it's in the High Court, and we're waiting a decision on that, or the Supreme Court. I mean, is this just a discussion? Is this a sort of academic discussion that the government is having? MPs like Miriam are urging the government to look seriously in the way Suella Braverman said about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, because they've just failed in their own policy to try and control immigration.
Well, it is important to separate legal and illegal.
It is.
Right? So the central problem with that stop the boats policy is there is no state in the world which has managed to completely reduce all illicit migration in or out of its borders. So the big political problem is the Prime Minister has promised something he can't deliver, and he does therefore need some form of words he can say to the voters, well, look, I know I made this promise I can't keep, but don't worry, I can do X. And at the moment, because he can't do the Rwanda policy, he doesn't want to upset some other people on his liberal flank over the ECHR, so he's kind of put himself in this difficult box. And that aggravates the problem of the legal migration, where you have some Conservative MPs like Miriam going, this is a disaster, we need to pull these numbers down. You have some other Conservative MPs going, this is great, this is helping our world-class university sector, we need to get those numbers up and up. But what it translates to, if you are an ordinary person just watching the 6 o'clock news, is the Conservative Party having this continual argument over immigration.
Yeah, I mean, how damaging is that continual argument over immigration within the party?
Well, I think lots of the continual arguments are unhelpful, full stop, because it prevents really progression in terms of, having a coherent way forward. The big issue here is that, as Stephen rightly says, the pledge that Rishi put forward, well, clearly we're seeing the groundwork laid as to why that pledge is not going to be met. So let's have a fight about something else and explain why we haven't managed to stop the boats. So we'll actually blame someone else for the fact it hasn't happened. And so that row is to some extent helpful, because it's taking away attention from actually what is or isn't physically being done to clamp down on the problem as it exists.
Well, and in terms of deflecting attention just momentarily away from the Chancellor's speech that is coming up in a few minutes' time, I think we can show you pictures there in the hall. Everyone is gathered. It's certainly quietened down a little bit outside here, where we're sitting in our makeshift studio. Members all gathered to hear what Jeremy Hunt will say, if anything meaningful in terms of tax, HS2, or benefits, which he certainly is going to talk about. We have heard from MPs, Miriam, on the programme calling for tax cuts. You are interested in tax breaks or tax cuts for families.
Yes.
What are you talking about exactly?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's true that we haven't got headroom for massive across-the-board tax cuts. I agree with that. But I do think one of the key challenges to the UK at the moment is productivity. And there are certain pinch points along the tax scale of people on particular incomes in particular circumstances where our tax regime very much is squashing productivity. So one example of that is families. As you say, in this country, we tax individuals rather than households. And that means you have a lot of anomalies in the tax system where parents perhaps try to work a bit longer hours or earn a bit more and end up losing sometimes 80% of that back to the Treasury. Now, that squashes productivity. The other area is small business. Our VAT threshold has remained at £80,000 for an awful long time. If you're a plumber and you're approaching £80,000 turnover, so remember turnover, not profit, so a lot of that is buying boilers from the wholesalers, you've got to make a decision. Do I take 2 months off and stop working, or do I charge my customers an extra 20%? That is a huge break on productivity. Those are the kind of areas, the tweaks that we should be making to boost productivity and, frankly, cut inflation.
Do you agree that there should be a change in the way people and households are taxed, that it should be families, not individuals?
we used to do some of that. We have got the married couples allowance that was brought in 2010. I'm sympathetic to the broad principle of it, but it wouldn't be my first priority in terms of tax cuts. I think I agree with Miriam in terms of the principle should be tax cuts to boost economic growth and enhancing productivity. But there's a whole range of different tax cuts that you can do to do that. And the point that she made about marginal rates taxation being up to 80% or 60% for individuals are far too high. Broadly, if somebody's working extra hours, they should keep the majority of what they earn and not have to hand it to the state. And that's what I'd urge the government to look at.
But it's not a priority, your first point, in terms of having some sort of tax breaks for households rather than individuals.
Well, I think it absolutely should be a priority, because what we're talking about here is people on ordinary incomes in ordinary situations being willing to work more hours or take a promotion. Now, you're not going to do that if out of every single pound you take home, you have to give 70 or 80p back to the Treasury. Nobody in their right mind would do that, and that itself is a break on productivity that we could fix relatively easily by tweaking the system.
Before I get Andy to respond, there's Rishi Sunak looking chipper, actually, taking his seat there in the hall. Of course, you remember a year ago it was Liz Truss, and we were awaiting Kwasi Kwarteng to stride onto the stage. Do you think people are listening to what Miriam's saying at the top of government?
I think at the top of government there are very, very interested in reducing marginal rates taxation. I mean, the broad point is that people, when they go out to work extra hours, they're having to pay too much out in tax. And certainly if people are paying 60%, and a lot of people are taxed to government for the extra hours they work, then it's a huge incentive not to do that extra work. And that absolutely needs to be tackled. Changing the style of family taxation or the basis of it is one way to do that. But there are lots of other ways to do that, like the taxation of child benefit, for example, and the child benefit penalty, which is what leads to the really high rates of taxation. But also people earning over 100,000. I know that's a lot of money, but they're all getting 60% rates of taxation. And further down, people get rates of 70%. And that all has to be tackled.
Right. I mean, the siren calls for tax cuts, just sort of broadly speaking, from parts of the Conservative Party are certainly not going to be met today. They might be looked at in some sort of pre-election giveaway, but one of the biggest issues that's discussed are the freezing of tax thresholds, which mean far more people are being dragged into a higher tax rate. That surely is where people are paying much more in tax.
Yes, that is one of the reasons why we're on course to be the highest tax rate in Parliament. It's precisely because of those frozen thresholds and fiscal drag.
Right. I mean, Joe, is something there for households, for individuals to think about that is why they're paying more tax, and that's happened under Conservative governments?
Absolutely. And so the sort of idea of having some kind of review of the taxation system, you know, it's a big thing to pledge then at an election that you're going to do some sort of wholesale reform, which you haven't thought about for 13 years. So it's quite a big, that would be quite a big move. And I suspect actually the public would be a little bit sceptical about it, because they'd wonder why there hadn't been this effort made before. So, you know, it's absolutely, when the Conservative government are looking at what next, Conservative MPs are all using the opportunity to sort of put pressure on. Why not? Absolutely, game on, they should go for it. But you know, then it's kind of what is the big divide between Labour and Tories at the next election? What does that look like? Do people believe they're going to be worse off under a Labour government when they've looked at how they've experienced the last 13 years? It's a big ask for people to sort of put their faith in someone else.
Right. I mean, you are part of a group of MPs lobbying the Prime Minister and the Chancellor on a regular basis. Is that because you think they're sort of weakened, perhaps, and this is the time to push your arguments forward?
Well, clearly we're coming up to an election, so we're all looking to the manifesto and what it's going to say. And I think if we think back to 2019, which feels an awful long time ago now, the reason we had such a resounding victory, an 80-seat majority, was because we appealed to a broad section of Conservative voters, people in our traditional shires, people in red wall areas like mine, people who wanted to take back control of our borders and our laws, yes, Brexit, but also to take back control of our country. And we wanted this kind of Conservative government. And, you know, Rishi Sunak's doing a great job. We love his 5 pledges. But as the New Conservatives, this group that
But he hasn't met any of them, of course, has he?
Well, we've all met Rishi on a regular basis.
But he hasn't met the 5 pledges, is what I mean.
Well, the 5, we all support the 5 pledges. What we're asking is to go further. So we saw what he said about net zero last week. The common sense of that cut through, and we've seen, you know, a modest increase in the polls. So we're asking for more of that, these common sense policies that really appeal to the voters, the realignment of voters that we were so successful with in 2019. Those are the kind of policies that should be in our manifesto.
Would you like to see more rowing back on net zero commitments?
I'm all in favour of pragmatism. I mean, I'm very committed to getting to net zero. We've got to do it in a way that has least impact on families in terms of their budgets and paying for boilers and so on. So I was very comfortable with what the Chancellor did on that. But one thing about tax, you've been asking us lots about tax cuts. I've yet to meet a Conservative who doesn't want to cut taxes. They are very high.
Yeah, but you are
But we've got to-
presiding over the highest tax burden on record.
That's what I was going to say is I completely support the government in saying the most important priority at the moment is getting inflation down, because that is the sort of unkindest tax cut of all and a tax rise of all. And actually we have to get that down. And it would be wrong to cut taxes in a way that led to a sudden burst of economic growth and inflation taking up again. And I think we all accept that. It is a difficult long-term decision. But we all want to see tax cuts. I want to see tax cuts.
Yeah, but how well are you doing on getting inflation down?
Well, it's come down from 11% to 6.7%.
Right, it said it would be halved at the end of the year. It's still,
It's getting pretty close to it. You've still got a couple more months.
6.7%. It has to come down to 5%. But the thing is, you've pledged that this is the priority.
I think we're going to hit that one.
But compared to other, let's say, European countries, we're still way higher.
6.4% in Germany. We're 6.7%. Look, it is too high. It is coming down, and I think I'm pretty confident we'll hit the 5% by the end of this year. We've got another few months to go.
Sorry, you were trying to say something.
No, I was just going to say I agree we can't make tax cuts that are inflationary, but there are some that wouldn't be, such as increasing the VAT threshold, because it would actually bring prices down. So I think there are some things that we could do now. We also haven't mentioned the role of the OBR, because one of the reasons
The Office
that
for Budget Responsibility in terms of forecasting.
Because one of the reasons that the Treasury resists tax cuts is because the OBR says, well, in 5 years' time, this will make your debt to GDP ratio X. Inflation will be this, but they're never right. The forecasts are never correct, and so almost the Treasury is held hostage to those forecasts that don't turn out to be true. So I think we also need to look at the role of the OBR, and
The OBR that was brought in, I think, by
George Osborne,
Chancellor,
absolutely.
yes.
But to at least look at their modelling and whether or not in the past it has been retrospectively correct, and what that impact that should have on tax cuts now.
I mean, in people's response to what they perhaps think is technocratic arguments still comes back to the issue that inflation is high. It's still costing people an awful lot of money. And this is a party, the Conservative Party, that is not united or unified in terms of its mission when it comes to the response on the economy. Liz Truss was just at a Fringe event. I think you were hanging around outside. An awful lot of grassroots Conservatives were there attending it when she's calling for tax cuts to corporation tax, fracking, and a major house building programme. That doesn't show a party unified in its mission.
No, exactly. I mean, look, this is the big problem, right? Right now, all of the Conservatives on this table are talking about tax cuts. But let me tell you, if Jeremy Hunt stood up and said, here's my plan for tax cuts, another group of Conservative MPs would start talking about the awful spending cuts this involved. And one of the big problems at this conference is, broadly speaking, the Conservative Party agrees and it doesn't like where it is right now, but it's not very agreed on where it would like to be next. And until they can get that basic level of agreement within themselves, I think it's unlikely that the political position is going to improve all that much in the country.
I mean, we had Chris Skidmore, Conservative MP, on the first programme, Joe. And, hold your breath. Here's Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor.
Good afternoon. The last time I spoke at conference was as Foreign Secretary 5 years ago. After that, I thought my time in government was over. So it's great to see the PM getting the over 50s back into meaningful work. I do, however, have some very youthful under 50s in my ministerial team. So thank you, John Glenn, Andrew Griffith, Vicky Atkins, Gareth Davis, Jojo Penn, Mark Fletcher, Paul Howell, Anthony Mangle and Andrew Stevenson for their brilliant work. And it's great to be in Manchester. Since 2010, this great region has seen unemployment halve, nearly 200,000 more jobs, and 6 new tech unicorns. Labour mayors talk up the problems, but it's Conservatives who chalk up the jobs. Now, our friends at the Office for National Statistics have recently changed their mind about the size of the British economy. They had been saying we were the worst performing large European economy since the pandemic. But we weren't the worst. We were one of the best. Since the pandemic, we've recovered better than France or Germany. We've grown faster than both of them since we left the single market. And since 2010, we've grown faster than France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria, Finland, the Netherlands, and Japan. So to all the pessimists and declinists who've been talking us down, we say this: don't bet against Britain. It's been tried before and it never works. Conference, it's nice to set the record straight, but Rishi Sunak and I care more about the future than the past. And our plan's very simple. We're going to make Britain a global leader in the industries of the future, the world's next Silicon Valley. And it's already happening. Last year, we became only the third trillion-dollar tech economy in the world. Our tech sector is now double the size of Germany's and 3 times France. British-discovered vaccines and treatments saved 7 million lives across the world in the pandemic, more than from any other country. We do more offshore wind than anywhere in Europe. We've got 3 huge electric car factories being built. We're Europe's biggest film and TV production centre. And next time I want to see Barbie wearing a Union Jack, because that too was filmed in Britain. My Mansion House reforms are part of that, because they'll help fast-growing companies source billions of pounds of extra capital. We don't just want them to start here, we want them to stay here, because as we become a science superpower, there's nowhere better to be. All this happens not from quick fixes, but from long-term decisions, which is what you get with Rishi Sunak. We Conservatives know if you get the economy right, everything else comes right too. So right now, we're focused on bringing down inflation. Nothing hurts families more when it comes to the weekly shop, heating bills, or pump prices, which is why the Prime Minister's pledged to halve it. And we're getting there. It was 11%, it's now down by 40%. The plan is working. And now we must see it through, just as Margaret Thatcher did many years ago. Conference, when we halve inflation, that's not a 1% income tax cut. It's a 5% boost to incomes compared to if it stayed the same. But just as we're succeeding, what's Labour planning? Some £28 billion a year of new borrowing. The Institute for Fiscal Studies say borrowing on that scale risks fueling inflation and keeping interest rates higher. Labour can change the fiscal rules, they can dress it up as responsible, but if they increase borrowing, they increase debt, and that means higher taxes, higher mortgages, and higher inflation for families. That's not an economic policy, it's an economic illusion. And it underlines the elemental choice in British politics, the choice behind all other choices. Sound money under the Conservatives or run out of money under Labour. Never again, Conference, never again. Conservatives will always protect public services, but we're also honest about the taxes that pay for them. After a once-in-a-century pandemic and the biggest energy crisis in a generation, the level of tax is too high. We were right to protect jobs and families, and thanks to Rishi's furlough scheme, we recovered faster from the pandemic than others. But with an aging population and a war in Europe, public spending is still growing faster than the economy. Now, some say that's inevitable. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said last week it's likely to be what they said was a decisive and permanent shift to a higher tax economy. Conference, they're wrong. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. If we increase public sector productivity growth by just 0.5%, we can stabilise public spending as a proportion of GDP. Increase it by more and we can bring the tax burden down. 0.5%. Now, for those of us with private sector backgrounds, that doesn't seem too much, does it? In the public sector, I'm telling you, it's harder. But we are up for the challenge. So I've commissioned my deputy, John Glenn, to restart the process of public service reform. John wants to know why teachers say that more than half their time is spent not actually teaching. Why police officers complain they spend longer filling out forms than catching criminals. Why doctors and nurses say they spend up to half their time, not with patients, but on admin. Of course, we need modern working practices and better IT. But the Treasury too needs to change its focus from short-term cost control to long-term cost reduction. And we're going to start with the civil service. We have the best civil servants in the world, and they saved many lives in the pandemic by working night and day. But even after that pandemic's over, we still have 66,000 more civil servants than before. New policies should not always mean new people. So today I'm freezing the expansion of the civil service and putting in place a plan to reduce its numbers to pre-pandemic levels. This will save £1 billion next year. And I won't lift that freeze until we have a proper plan, not just for the civil service, but for all public sector productivity improvements. That means, amongst other things, changing our approach to equality and diversity initiatives. Smashing glass ceilings is everyone's job, not a box to be ticked by hiring a diversity manager. But I'm going to surprise you with one equality and diversity initiative of my own. And trust me, you'll like this one. Nobody should have their bank account closed because somebody else decides they're not politically correct. We'll tighten the law to stop people being debanked for the wrong political views. The Lib Dems are wrong to want to overturn a democratic Brexit vote, but they still need a cash point to withdraw their euros. The SNP are wrong to ignore a democratic vote for the union, but they still need a bank account to pay for their motorhomes. And even Keir Starmer, who's wrong on just about everything, needs his trade union cash so he too can have a bank account, just never the keys to Downing Street. There's somewhere else where we need to rethink the way the state works, our welfare system. I'm proud to live in a country where, as Churchill said, there's a ladder everyone can climb, but also a safety net below which no one falls. That safety net is paid from tax. And that social contract depends on fairness to those in work alongside compassion to those who aren't. And that means work must pay. We're making sure it does. From last year, for the first time ever, you can earn £1,000 a month without paying a penny of tax or national insurance. But despite that, even when companies are struggling to find workers, around 100,000 people are leaving the labour market every year for a life on benefits. Mel Stride gets this 100%, which is why he's replacing the work capability assessment. And we're going to look at the way the sanctions regime works. It isn't fair that someone who refuses to look seriously for a job gets the same as someone trying their best. Now, Labour have pledged to end sanctions. Have they learned nothing? When they left office, we had more children in workless households than nearly anywhere in Europe. Since then, those households are down by 1 million, and conference, we are never, ever going back. So to make sure work continues to pay, today I take a step forwards towards completing another great Conservative reform, the National Living Wage. Since we introduced it, nearly 2 million people have been lifted from absolute poverty after housing costs, not by tax credits or benefits, but by removing the barriers to work, boosting salaries, cutting tax, making work pay. We promised in our manifesto to raise the national living wage to 2/3 of median income, ending low pay in this country. At the moment, it's £10.42 an hour, and we're waiting for the Low Pay Commission to tell us next year's recommendation. But I confirm today, whatever that recommendation, we'll increase the national living wage to at least £11 an hour next year. That's a pay rise for 2 million workers, and the wages of the lowest paid over £9,000 higher than they were in 2010. Because if you work hard, a Conservative government will always have your back. It's easy to support higher growth, better public services, and lower taxes. Harder to make it happen. In Britain today, there's only one party prepared to make those difficult decisions. Our party and our Prime Minister, whose diligence and tenacity have given us the Windsor Framework, the Atlantic Declaration, the Trans-Pacific Trade Deal, and the NHS Workforce Plan, whose own life story shows just what's possible with education, aspiration, and hard work. His story and our story. More growth, more jobs, more doctors, more nurses, better schools, less poverty, less crime. Conference, it's time to roll up our sleeves, take on the declinists, and watch the British economy prove the doubters wrong. Thank you.
Well, that was quite short and sweet. That was Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, delivering his conference speech to the party faithful. They're up on their feet. I think they got a slight surprise that it finished slightly abruptly, but yes, there they are, clapping him off the stage. He talked for about just over 20 minutes or so and outlined some of the things that the government will be looking at, including the benefits regime. No actual firm concrete policies as yet, but certainly be looking at it. Stephen Bush and Joe Tanner, my guests, are still with us to discuss the speech. Starting with you, Joe, what did you make of it?
It was short.
Yes.
That seemed incredibly short. I mean, the economy is one of the biggest issues, and yet it was, for me, it felt like a short speech with not a great deal in it.
Right. What do you think that says, Stephen Bush, about what the government has to say on some of the key issues of the day when it comes to inflation and tax cuts and people feeling better or worse off?
Well, in some ways, it's a reflection on some of the divisions we heard across this table from our two MP guests before he started speaking. Then he had a strategic choice he could have made there, which is to say, look, there's a divide in this party, and I am on X side or Y side to take on and try and resolve some of those divisions. And he's opted not to. Instead, the dividing line he wants to draw is effectively with the Institute of Fiscal Studies, who have said, look, we are on a trajectory to higher taxes because we have aging population, darkening geopolitical situation. And essentially he's saying, no, look, I think I can hold that rise in tax down. We can continue to have lower taxes than the European average and, pretty good public services. And I have a plan to do that through increasing productivity, freezing civil service recruitment. Now, that's quite a big ask. It's possible he can pull it off. But I think in many ways, the reason why that's the more tempting choice if you're a Conservative Chancellor right now is it avoids having to take on those divisions.
I mean, one of the things, as I mentioned, is about the benefits regime. He made quite a big play to Mel Stride, the Work and Pensions Secretary, about how they are going to get a lot of people, and there's been a huge increase in the number of people who are on what you would call long-term sickness benefits. But there is a problem at the heart of doing that. Yes, you can have a bit more stick rather than carrot and encourage people who want to go back to work and give them incentives. But if it is down to perhaps mental health issues, for example, how is that going to...
Or something else, a physical health issue, and you can't get an appointment to see a GP, you can't get your referral to a hospital, you know, there's a cycle, there's a chain of things that go on here. So it isn't just about I don't believe there is a suggestion that there's a bunch of people who are just not interested in going to work. Mel Stride himself said there are a lot of people where sickness is an issue, and mental health is a big problem since the pandemic. It's a big problem in schools as well.
Yes.
And so the fact that there are the problems with the health system and how that then engages means it doesn't really matter what incentives you put in, whether it's sticks or carrots. Actually, how are you going to help those people get better so they can actually hold down a job?
I mean, do you think it was the right priority, or one of them, to look at the benefit system? Of course, the cost of the welfare bill is something, no doubt, that Jeremy Hunt would like to see come down. But with that sort of issue at the heart of the benefit system, it's not going to be that easy.
Well, so this is a political line which was very successful for the Conservatives under George Osborne.
Yeah.
But one quite big change since then is precisely that we have a lot of people who are long-term ill because they can't access the medical help they need. Now, in terms of the detail of what he just spoke about, I think he's actually talking about a much smaller number of people who are seeking work rather than people who are too ill to work. But I think the political danger is I think most people will hear it and they won't go, oh, you're talking about this teeny tiny 100,000 people who are seeking work. They'll go, well, my friend used to work and they've been waiting, 18 months for a hip replacement. Why haven't you dealt with that? So I think that although there is a real political issue around this comparatively small group of people, I again would worry if I were a Conservative strategist that all people hear is that much bigger, much more expensive to tackle problem of people who are long-term sick, and I would think, oh, why are they proposing more stick to deal with the problem of the long-term sick?
What do you think the reaction will be from people here? You've been mingling around some of the fringe events and talking to people, and we were discussing it while the Chancellor was talking too. Do you think they get it, people here, as to what they're trying to say, Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak?
I think to some extent, yes, but at the same time, everybody is frustrated when they see these people being interviewed and they can't answer a question and everything's being put off. And, every year we have an autumn statement, we have that fiscal event, and yet there is a party conference before where they can answer questions, and yet there's this big kind of tussle, which is, well, we're going to talk about that later. We are in the very place, for example, with HS2, where it would be ending, and yet nobody can answer a straight question on that. So it is incredibly frustrating, and I think people will feel slightly annoyed. I think they will feel that they aren't getting the full truth, they aren't getting the answers. And it looks very evasive, which is just not a good look for any politician.
Well, this is a good point to invite and say hello to the Treasury Minister, Gareth Davis, who joins us now after that speech. Thank you for running from the conference hall. It was quite short, wasn't it, the speech? Did it feel like he just didn't have quite enough to say, Jeremy Hunt?
I think he said quite a lot, but the main message, obviously, was that we've got to control inflation. That is the number one priority, and from that we can grow our economy and be a country that really invests in the high growth industries that will serve us longer term.
We'll come on to inflation in just a moment. Joe Tanner was just saying that actually people are frustrated here, the party faithful, that they can't get clarity on some key decisions. We are hearing that HS2, the leg to Manchester, to the city where you are holding this year's conference, is likely to be scrapped. Is that the case? Is that what you've been told?
Well, I'm not going to speculate and comment on speculation in the media as you wouldn't expect me to. But
yeah,
what
but
I can
they would have been briefed probably by ministers.
But what I can tell you is that the British public would expect us, whenever costs overrun on a major infrastructure project, we're going to have conversations about that. We're going to look at that and the viability of that, and that's what's happening.
Right, but in terms of a message that is coming from government, you can't tell us about HS2, despite the fact that we've been discussing it for days and that we're based here where your conference is in Manchester. And also, we've got two messages on tax cuts. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt have both said it's unlikely, certainly at the moment. Michael Gove, a member of the same government, said yesterday very clearly, I want to see tax cuts before the next election. Who's right?
Let me add to it. We all want to see tax cuts.
Before the next election?
We all want to see tax cuts.
Before the next election?
When the time is right. And what we've been very consistent and very clear on is that the number one priority right now is tackling inflation, bearing down on inflation, which is a tax on everybody. It's a tax on businesses and individuals and families. That's why we're on an important downward trajectory, but we can't cut taxes based on borrowing. We're just not going to do that.
Right. In terms of tax cuts, though, and the tax take, every Conservative says that they want to be, and the party is still, a low taxation party. But of course it isn't. Let's just show you some headlines for a report from experts. They are the Institute for Fiscal Studies. The Evening Standard. Rishi Sunak set to preside over biggest tax-raising parliament on record, say experts. And I think we can also see a headline in The Guardian which talks about the same thing. UK households face tax rise of £3,500 a year by next election, says the IFS. How can you ever say you're the party of low taxation when we're presiding over the biggest tax-raising parliament ever in recent history?
Well, first of all, I think it's right that we stepped in during two global shocks, the pandemic and the energy crisis, with a significant package of support, which I think we need to appreciate needs paying for. And so countries around the world have high taxation, and we've certainly got higher taxation than we would like. But again, I would just point out the fact that we've invested significant sums in the British people. The furlough scheme allowed us to grow faster than most countries in our competitive landscape because we invested that cash.
Yes, and you're absolutely right about the global shocks, and everybody was affected by it. But actually, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that the tax rises brought in by your government have largely been the consequence of a desire for higher government spending on things that predate the pandemic, such as manifesto promises to expand the NHS workforce and hire more police officers, and a September 2019 declaration to be turning the page on austerity. Now, you've willingly raised taxes, rightly, maybe, before the pandemic.
We've been very clear, in fact the Chancellor's just been very clear with the British public that we don't want a bigger state. We do want to get taxes down. That is absolutely
you
clear.
may do, but you've done these things before the pandemic or leading into the pandemic. They predate them. So it's not just about the global shocks that everyone faced.
A significant proportion is about the global shocks, and that is very, very important to recognise. But we have also lifted 3 million people out of paying income tax. We've also got the most generous capital allowances scheme in the OECD, and we've got the lowest corporation tax in the G7. So we are investing through tax cuts where we think we can derive growth and investment through our businesses, and that's really important to stress.
The global shocks were absolutely critical in terms of things like the furlough scheme that Gareth has been talking about. But it is also true that taxes rose predate the pandemic on things like having a bigger state. Will people believe and trust the Conservatives when they keep saying we will be, again, a low taxation party?
So I don't think they will. I think in many ways, right, we're seeing a very similar situation to we saw after the global financial crisis, where, yes, that crisis was not the fault of the then Labour government, but the Labour government kind of didn't want to be straight with people about what that meant for the fiscal picture. Now, the reality is the reason why we've had higher tax raises is not when we're servicing the debt than we incurred due to those crisis-fighting measures. It's because we have an aging population which puts more pressure on healthcare, and there were those political decisions, more police, more hospitals that we saw in the 2019 election. And I think the risk to the Conservatives is that they go into the next election with a set of tax cut policies in which they are broadly not believed. And that creates the space for the Labour Party to say, well, look, obviously, look, the fiscal situation is what it is. And that means that the Labour Party can run in the next election as the sensible, economically credible adults in the room, which is precisely the same strategic mistake Gordon Brown made in 2010, when instead of fighting on their cuts versus our cuts, he chose to fight on a la, 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 I can't hear you, the financial crisis hasn't changed anything ticket.
And there's a general problem here, which is all this tax is being paid, and yet most people don't feel any better off. They don't think their streets are cleaner. They don't think their streets are safer. They don't think the services that they interact with are any better. So where is all that money going? What is happening to it that they don't feel genuinely like they're paying into a system that's actually giving them a better quality of life and, you know, a better experience as a citizen of the UK. Something's clearly going wrong in that balance.
I mean, what do you say to that? I mean, that is the narrative. Britain is broken and its public services, and yet there is still the highest tax take on record.
I think I would point out, for example, on education, standards are up quite significantly. If you actually look at the facts, we have improved services, but it is a genuine point that people need to also feel that it is changing in their lives. A big part of this, by the way, is what the Chancellor just announced on public sector productivity, and that is going to be a big focus for us as we run into the next few months.
All right, let's talk about HS2, because as I say, there is fevered speculation about the Manchester leg being scrapped, and our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, has just arrived. What are we hearing?
Well, look, for the last week or so, it seemed pretty clear that the government wants to scrap the leg between Birmingham and Manchester. It felt like the pitch was being rolled, to use the Westminster jargon, for that to happen. There's been a lot of talk over the past 24 hours. You hear it in all the bars around here. You hear it from every Tory activist you speak to, that something is going to happen within the next day or so. I've just chatted to someone from Number 10 who is absolutely insistent that the final decision on this hasn't been made. But that said, I think it's pretty clear where the decision making is going. Nobody is denying that that Manchester leg is going to be scrapped. But if it does happen in the next 24 hours or so,
Here, they're going to announce, and they're going to announce it here,
Well, look,
in Manchester.
There are two arguments I've heard from people in government about this. One is it's mad to do it because we will all talk about has Rishi Sunak sold out the North, blah, blah, blah. There will probably be a package, by the way, assuming this happens.
Yes.
There'll probably be a package to make up for it. The money will be spent elsewhere, perhaps on the east to west leg that a lot of Northern Conservative MPs prefer to the HS2 leg. But the other argument that you hear walking around here is it's just gone on for too long. And every day,
Yes.
all government ministers are being asked about is why on earth they haven't made their mind up on HS2.
Well, I mean, everybody has been discussing the words of the Chancellor, saying that no formal decision has been made, but that implies that something informal has. And maybe it just needs a final signing off. And actually, before I get your response on that, is that generally what's been happening, Gareth? There isn't an official, or it hasn't been formally signed off, but perhaps you and others have been told informally.
I'm not going to comment on
Have you been told, though, one way or the
speculation
other?
that you referred
No, but
to.
perhaps you could
But I
tell us
would-
one way or the other if you've been told.
I
You
think
may
it's
not want
really
to say.
important to point out that rail transportation is one aspect to levelling up the North. We've already invested, by the way, £33 billion in the North. But just look around Manchester. It's got a fantastic bus network, tram network. People are walking around and cycling. It is not just about rail, but I'm not going to comment on the specifics of what you're referring to.
Well, make the argument for HS2 from Birmingham to Manchester. Why is it a good idea?
I'm not going to comment on the speculation that you're trying
I'm
to
not
drag me
speculating.
into.
Is there
I
no
think-
argument left then to say that it is worthwhile pursuing this project, high-speed rail from Birmingham?
As you would expect, whenever taxpayer money is spent, we will review each project, not just at the beginning, but as it goes along, to make sure that it's offering value for money. I'm confident that that review work is going on.
But what about the billions that have already been spent? I mean, tens of billions of pounds, and you're going to say you're not going to go on with it? All that money, or a large proportion of it, will have been wasted.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it is important that we review at every step of the way massive projects like HS2.
Maybe there's a double bluff going on here. Jeremy Hunt flew up here, didn't he? Because he couldn't get his train.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a double bluff, and then he'll say, this is exactly why we need it, because I couldn't even get up here when I needed to. And maybe we're all being lulled into some false sense of sort of, you know, speculation, and then they're going to come and surprise us.
You're smiling.
You never
there,
know.
Gav. You heard it here
He
first.
knows
Yes.
the true story.
Yes.
I just want to read you a statement that's just been sent out by Number 10
By number 10, yes.
on the speculation, as you put it. These reports are incorrect. No final decisions have been taken on phase 2 of HS2. That's a Number 10 spokeswoman. Final decisions, though, we've got to bear in mind that there's a wording there. It does still seem that that's the direction of travel, but Number 10 are insisting, as we're on air just now, that that final decision hasn't been made.
Right, I mean, 13 years, high-speed rail. Are we really going to hear an announcement that it's been scrapped or perhaps delayed for years?
Well, that's pretty clearly the direction of travel,
Yes.
right? Because if it wasn't, then we would have just heard a very eloquent argument about how the Manchester leg is important to turning Birmingham into a proper transport hub. And if you don't do it, then Curzon Street ends up a white elephant, New Street ends up a white elephant. And so everything points in one direction. And it does feel like the visual image of this high-speed 2 line, which was meant to connect the great cities of England, instead essentially barely reaching London, no offence to any viewers in Ealing, and stopping at Birmingham, it does feel like the kind of thing which happens in a kind of failed state run by the army rather than a modern 21st century
And aren't
OSU
we good
nation.
at instilling confidence in all these amazing businesses that are looking at the UK and whether to invest here and create jobs and, you know, build stuff and support local economies when we just can't communicate a decision? I mean, it makes us look ridiculous.
Oh, you agree?
These
There was a
reviews
nod,
are
actually.
ongoing, but I think most people watching your show today would expect that when we are looking at multiple billions of pounds of spending, that we constantly review that for value for money for the taxpayer. That is what we're doing, and that's what you would expect us to do at every step of the way.
I mean, it must be frustrating. It must be frustrating for ministers like you to have to come on and talk about these important issues without having any clarity or being allowed, perhaps, to announce or at least further the speculation in any way.
I would just point out I've got a lot to say on the things that we are already doing,
All right.
the £33 billion of investment into the north and the transportation around here.
I'm going to let you go, Nick Eardley, and I'm going to come back to inflation, since that's how you started the interview. Let me just show you this graph and our viewers. Inflation in advanced economies. We know that Rishi Sunak wants to halve the level of inflation. It was just over 10% or so. You can see it's at 6.7%, higher than Germany, France, Italy, and a lot higher than the US. Why have you failed so badly on inflation?
Well, first of all, it's a global issue, as your chart shows.
Yeah,
Every
and we're the
country
highest
around
there.
the world is having, well, not every
Yeah.
country is on that chart.
No,
by
I
the way,
said, but of those there.
But of those, you're right. But every market is very different. We've also got a much more resilient demand, you know, in terms of demand and growth, as we've seen from the recent revisions by the ONS. And so, you know, we've got to balance that. But the downward trajectory is very, very important to stress. It's been going in the right direction. Yes, we want to halve it, but we still want to go further than that, by the way. It's still high at 5%.
Yes, but this is your top priority.
Yeah, and it's
And
going
if this is your top priority, and we're still higher than Germany, which is having a pretty terrible time economically anyway, France, Italy, and the US, people will just think, gosh, that's the #1 priority for Rishi Sunak and for the Treasury and Jeremy Hunt. And it's failed on its own terms. We still have higher inflation than those other comparable countries.
The priority is very clear. We want to halve inflation by the end of the year. The IMF, the OBR, the Bank of England all say we're going to achieve that. Let's see, but we absolutely are laser-like focused on getting it down to half. There are different dynamics in different markets. We've got a tighter labour market than some of those. We've got more resilient demand. So it's not as simple as you are suggesting, but the best thing I can point out is that it is going down, and that is a really important thing to champion.
Stephen.
Well, look, the reality is that the UK economy has always struggled with more persistent inflation than most other peer countries. And we've had a major shock in the form of the energy crisis caused by the invasion of Ukraine. And actually, look, this isn't really the government's fault or something it can control. And I'm afraid the original sin here is Rishi Sunak pledging something which wasn't within his gift, which is primarily, and actually in terms of the stuff the government can do, broadly speaking, the government is doing all of the right things, but you shouldn't in politics make promises that aren't within your gift and you can't control. And this is a promise that isn't within his gift and he can't control, and it creates this very difficult media round for any Conservative minister who has to explain why in a way that also inevitably sounds a bit out of touch, because yes, the record is better than, yes, this is good and its number is going down, but for most households, they don't go, oh boy, I'm getting poorer at a slightly slower rate. It just is a bit of a nightmare for the Conservative Party.
Sorry, I've got to respond to that.
Yeah.
The IMF disagree with you. They've outlined that we've taken decisive action on inflation. You all know the primary method of bearing down on inflation is through monetary policy and our independent Bank of England. What we can do in the Treasury is one of two things, or both. first of all, not to exacerbate inflation. That means taking some quite difficult decisions, whether it's on public sector pay or reducing taxation, for
But
example.
you know as well as I do that
And
public
secondly,
sector pay has a negligible effect on overall wage demand.
it is a contributing factor of which we do have control on, or we've had to make difficult decisions on. The second area, though, which the IMF have outlined, is that we have levers to pull. So we can freeze fuel duty like we did, and that helped with inflation. The energy price guarantee, the OBR said, would take off 2% of headline inflation. So it is not the case that it's easy sailing and we can't do anything about it. There are things that we can do, most of all, making sure that fiscal policy is aligned with monetary policy as the Bank of England bear down.
Surely you accept most of that remain. If you don't hit your target, it will be because the monetary arm has not, for a whole bunch of reasons. I'm not saying the Bank of England is necessarily to blame either. But surely you accept that part of the problem here is that pledge has made you the sole owners of a problem that was not born in Downing Street and where many of the solutions lie well outside of it.
By making it a key priority, what we're saying is we're not going to exacerbate inflation, and we're going to use the levers that we have to get it down, like the energy price guarantee. But I've been very clear. We have to make sure that fiscal policy is aligned with monetary policy as they bear down through interest rates.
Joe?
I just sit here I hear a lot of noise, and I think this is a debate that's gone on and on and on. And, you know, the big question is, when this inflation target is hit, we go into election mode, and this all just gets even worse, doesn't it? And the public just end up just as baffled at the end of it about what that really means for their own finances.
Well, let's just pick up on a tweet that has just appeared from David Frost, who was the former Brexit minister. He was part of the cabinet. This is his response to Jeremy Hunt. I don't often say this, but well done, Jeremy Hunt. We can already get from London to Manchester in 30 minutes, even without HS2. And that's because the Chancellor flew from London to Manchester. A modern society needs more flights, not fewer. Do you agree?
We need all modes of transport to make sure we're as productive as possible. Mobility of people is one of the key factors for productivity growth. That includes rail, it includes roads, it includes air and by sea as well. So we need all of it.
But not HS2 from
We
Birmingham
need
to
all
Manchester.
modes of transportation. That's why we've invested 33 billion in the north of England.
What do you make of the tweet from David Frost, Joe?
Just wondering if we should check his register of interest and see if he's got a side gig with some sort of airline or an airport that have got an interest in this issue. There is obviously a jibe there at Jeremy about taking that flight, but it doesn't solve the bigger issue on how we ensure people can travel up the country effectively.
Well, no one is ever going to fly from Manchester to, say, High Peak. And of course, the thing that High Speed 2 does, it allows you to free up those local railway lines by putting the big trains on this big new high-speed railway. So that tweet, I think, does show a slight confusion about what High Speed 2 is for. It's not really about the speed of London to Manchester. That's a nice benefit, an optional extra. What really matters is that it allows you to have more local routes on smaller rails. That's why the Birmingham to Manchester leg is really important to Birmingham as well. Yes, they have the benefit of the London bit, but what they need is to be able to unlock all of those local journeys in the West Midlands.
Well, and of course there are roads, aren't there, and drivers too. And Rishi Sunak made quite a big thing about wanting to restrict 20-mile-per-hour limits that have been brought in by a number of local authorities. So having waged war on the motorists for 13 years, you're now doing an about turn.
That's not what we're saying, and we've been very clear that we don't agree, for example, with ULEZ, which is adding
the
a
ultra-low emission zone.
significant cost to people in London and the South
So
East.
why did you legislate for councils to have to meet air quality targets? One of the easiest and perhaps most obvious ways is to bring in an ultra-low emission zone and charge for it.
We want to work with local authorities. It's important that we do devolve wherever possible, and decision-making should be taken at a local level. But where we think it is having a disproportionate impact on people's incomes, or where we think it's not having an impact on things like clean air, we will say that. And I think the British public would expect us to do that.
Yeah, what did you make of what Rishi Sunak has been saying on green policies more general, moving some of the targets, delaying, watering them down, according to his critics, and this specifically on 20-mile-per-hour limits on drivers?
It feels like someone reminded the Conservatives of Mondeo Man and the value of Mondeo Man's votes, because it feels like they've suddenly remembered that there's a group of people who actually don't rely on public transport but do rely on their cars for lots of different reasons. And this, there's a very interesting point that Gareth just said there, which is, we're very pro devolving, but actually we won't devolve if we don't like what you're doing. And that's then quite a big ideological issue, because if you're actually voting in a local government, a local council that is not the same colour as the governing party, this kind of row between the national approach and the local approach is going to be increasing all the time. So I personally, I think there's a value in 20-mile-an-hour zones in the right places, but there has definitely been a creep of those. But this principle this is clearly about something that's polling well, and the Tories are going with it.
Stephen, is it going to be a vote winner?
Well, I think it's one of the things people do really understand their council does. And it clearly has been a vote winner in areas where the council has got it wrong. But what would worry me if I were a Conservative MP is it didn't seem to do the 1,000 councillors who lost their seats much help in May. So I think unless we have delivery on those big things of the economy and public services, it's not a shield I would want if I were a marginal MP in the West Mids, for example.
I mean, Chris Skidmore, once again, he was here, very much a supporter of green policies, thought it was cat-handed, this whole idea, because you've got Conservative authorities who have already introduced 20-mile-per-hour limits. What do you say to him?
What I'm saying to him is that we are taking a very pragmatic, proportionate, realistic approach when it comes to the green agenda. We're building off a very strong base. As the British public know, we've decarbonised faster than any country in the G7. So we are able to make sure that we don't have a disproportionate impact on families and businesses. And we also are very clear that we have a long-term direction of policy working with local authorities, but on the green agenda, we've got to bring people with us. And clearly, when you have policies that are not bringing people with you, they react, and that's what happened, for example, with ULEZ in.
Yeah, but Chris Skidmore said earlier that the Conservative Party is turning its face on road safety with these sorts of policies. There is a huge benefit to those 20-mile-per-hour speed limits because you're less likely to kill someone if you're in an accident.
Well, that is a factor. If you go slower, the damage is to be less. But you've got to do it in a proportionate way and assess depending on the area. And that's what we're saying. Where it's not effective, then we shouldn't have 20-mile-an-hour zones. And instead of having blanket across the country 20-mile-an-hour zones like they do in some Labour-run administrations, we don't think that's right. We're just looking for a proportionate, realistic and evidence-based approach.
Right. I mean, you talk about long-term decisions, and Rishi Sunak has said that this is one of them. The pragmatic approach Gareth is talking about to net zero and green policies. Or is it for short-term political electioneering?
Well, everything's short-term political electioneering. There's not a lot going to happen in terms of legislation or really serious action. You walk around here, you talk to MPs, you even talk to ministers who openly say the civil service aren't going to do a lot in the next year. They're on kind of this waiting for an election mode. There's not a lot that you can realistically achieve in such a short amount of time. And so these are, some of these things are quite big issues, but they're eye-catching. They're about saying, we've noticed, we're on your side, we recognise where your problems are, and actually, guess what? The polls kind of respond accordingly. So while we see a bit of this, we'll do a bit more. I'm sure out there plenty of people are thinking, yay, I've been saved from 7 bins being outside my house, which none of us knew we were going to get. But, it made people feel a bit better. They suddenly think, oh, maybe the Tories aren't all bad. And this is the period we're going to be in. We're going to see more of it next week with Labour. We're going to have this kind of newfound interest in areas or newfound direction, which is all flying kites ahead of what's going to work to then sit in a manifesto for then, people to vote on next year. So it's all the start of laying that groundwork.
Right. I mean, what is the actual policy, though, on 20 mile per hour? Because it's not blocking authorities from doing it, is it? It is just rhetoric.
I think it's a Department for Transport lead, but I think it's something we're looking at very carefully, as you know.
What, in terms of blocking authorities actually introduced it?
We're going to review the appropriateness of 20-mile-an-hour zones in areas where it may not be as effective as some people think.
I mean, it might appeal to voters in some constituencies, but actually, is it more about the rhetoric? In terms of actual policy change, has anything really changed?
Well, it's hard to tell until this review finishes its process. I do think, politically, it does help the government. And I think in the summer, the administration looked a little bit like it was just waiting for the electorate to put it out of its misery. And actually, even before you get into whether or not these are the right policy mix, just that there is some sign of policy life coming from Downing Street is, I think, probably a good thing for the Tory party's hopes at the next election.
Right, and growth. Let's talk about growth. What does it really mean? I'm sure when people watch this programme, they think it is literally just an economic term. It doesn't really change anything for my day-to-day cost of living and bills. How are you going to get the economy to grow?
Well, it is already growing, and you'll notice the ONS have revised up quite significantly their previous estimates. One of the things during the pandemic that we did was the furlough to connect people, employees, with their employers, so that when we opened up, we were able to grow faster, and we did.
And that's true, coming out of the pandemic. But when you take it back a little further, pre the pandemic, perhaps after the EU referendum, growth has been pretty anemic, hasn't it?
Obviously, we're always trying to grow our economy.
Well, I realise
what the markets want and what businesses want is certainty, and they want stability. And obviously, when we left the European Union, as we figured out the new arrangement with our friends and partners with the European Union, there was that uncertainty, just as there was uncertainty through the pandemic and the energy shock. But what we are doing is being very clear that we want to increase workforce participation, we want to boost business investment. Those are the things that can grow our economy, and that will grow our economy in the years to come.
Right, I mean, tax cuts, of course, would be one way of growing the economy, but of course they're seen as inflationary.
And also, crucially, we are spending a lot of money on the public service promises that the government made and on debt interest. So there also just actually isn't really the fiscal headroom for major tax cuts. So I think, although, of course, Jeremy Hunt is someone who would very dearly like to cut taxes, he's not bluffing when he says that. He's also not bluffing when he stands up and says, look, it's very difficult. And it's, I think, fairly likely that there won't be the headroom for the big tax cuts than many people in this conference crave.
Right, I mean, what sort of growth are we talking about, though, Gareth? On the basis of the policies that you have now, there's no predictor of any return to high growth levels, is there?
Well, we're doing everything we can to ensure that we achieve high growth, and we're already predicted to grow faster than most of our peers, Germany, France and Italy. We will be growing faster than them.
What are those things?
What are the things that we're doing? So first of all, we've got to boost workforce participation at the budget. We made a series of childcare reforms, as you will have seen, and today the Chancellor outlined that we want to tackle those who are on benefits, get them back into work. We want to have a look at
actually
the long-term
on that.
sick.
Sorry to interrupt. I don't mean to interrupt you, but just while I think about it, otherwise I'll forget. On the benefits, why not until 2025? Why is this review taking all this time? That'll be beyond the next election, which you are, possibly likely to lose.
I think it's right that we take our time, review it properly to get those back into work. We've been very clear that work is the best route out of poverty. We've been clear that we want to get on the back and side of workers with the minimum wage that the Chancellor just announced he would be rising to £11 when it comes out. But just on this point of growth, all year we've heard from forecasters that we'd be in a recession by now. That hasn't happened.
Right.
We've seen significant uprating by the forecasters.
For that period coming out of the pandemic, but as I say, you can take a broader period. You can take from 2010. You could take since the EU referendum. And as I say, growth has been low or anemic at best.
We want to grow our economy, but we have to appreciate that we've had 3 global shocks in the last 15 years. 2 have happened in the last 3 years. That inevitably has an impact, but we are very focused on boosting business investment. By the way, in the world, we've got the second largest FDI stock just to the United States, right? So we're already building off a very strong base. We've got some of the world leading academic institutions. We've got a competitive tax regime. We've got lots of the fundamental pillars that will allow us to grow through business investments.
How do you view what you've just heard from Gareth in terms of, yes, a year perhaps till the next general election for some of these things to happen? The benefits regime, a new one, wouldn't come in until afterwards.
And that's the problem. It's not dissimilar to this issue about 7 bins and other things that we apparently have been saved from. It's a lot of talk about things that are going to happen, but not actually anything that people are going to see in reality, they're not going to see anything physically delivered. So it's lots of talk about things that we're going to do, lots of talk about what we'd like to do, but not actually anything that's being delivered. So Gareth's absolutely right. There have been some improvements in the economy, but not enough for people to fill in their pockets.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much to you, Gareth Davis, for joining us from the Treasury, and to my other guests, Joe Tanner and Stephen Bush. I'll be back tomorrow, of course, with more Politics Live from the conferences at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer, and on Wednesday, 11:30 until 1:30, an extended programme to take in the Prime Minister's speech. And on Thursday, I'll be back in London with more Politics Live at 12:15. But from all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.